Hey guys, so my topic that I'm supposed to talk about is CSS Cascade and inheritance, and I'm Riker Steglich. So let's get right into it. Cascade, what does that mean? So style sheets, as we've known, because they're called cascading style sheets, the ones that we use. They cascade. And what that means is simply that the order in which you put in your style rules or properties matter. And this cascading can be divided into different sections or different rules. The first of those is source order, specificity, and importance. And we'll talk about each one of those individually, and I'll have some examples for you to look at so that we can all see what those are. So let's talk about source order. So that just goes back to the basic rule of what cascading style sheets is that order matters. It matters what way you put your rules or your tags into your code. So in this case, if you have two rules that are for the same element or the same object in your code, then the last one with equal weight wins, or the last one with equal weight is the one that your code is going to show. So here's an example of this. We can see here on the top I used an online coding editor through w3.org. So we can see on the top, you can see that I have included some style sheets in my code, and we have two rules here. The first one says that for our H1, our header ones, we're giving it the property of color blue. And for our the second rule is also for header 1, H1, and gives the color red. And we can see here on the bottom the example or the output for that code, and it's showing that our text this is my first heading is in fact red. And so that is because the H1 rule in the style sheet that has the color red comes last. So like I was explaining earlier, any rule with the equal weight, with rules of equal weight, the last one is the one that will be applied. So moving forward to a second example, we can see that I've switched those around. Our first H1 now says color red, and our second H1 now says color blue. So as you can see, now that blue is the last rule, our text that reads my first heading is blue. So I'll give you guys a second to look at that, but that's kind of the gist of source order. That's the basic concept of Cascade. So next we'll move on to specificity. So this changes, or is another aspect of cascading. If you have rules that are the same weight, the last one's going to win, which is what we learned about in source order. But in specificity, it's the more specific selector wins, or the more specific selector will be applied to your code. And so there are different levels of specificity. And specificity is defined by ones, tens, hundreds, and thousands. And so to kind of put that into perspective, element selectors have the lowest specificity, or are considered ones. After element selectors, we have classes. So when you assign a class to one of your elements and then choose to give it properties in CSS by that class, it is in specificity, it is defined as in the tens category. And then there's IDs. And so IDs that you can also give to your HTML elements, when you choose to give an element CSS properties using an ID, it is defined in the hundreds of specificity. And then thousands, from the information that I was reviewing, talked about kind of general CSS rules that don't have specific selectors, and those ones have the highest degree of specificity, meaning that they will be applied. So let's look at some examples of those. Again, I've used the same text editor in the previous examples. So right here we see what we kind of saw at the beginning. We have two H1 headers. There are two H1 rules, and in each of those we have a different color. And we can see that the color red is the one that is being shown in our text editor. So with that in mind, with what we've known before, all we could really do is try and flip-flop those and make it so that the blue one would show up. Now, however, we can see in the second example that I've given a class to the H1 element in my HTML. I've given it the class of heading. And so if you look up towards the top of the text editor, you can see that I have used that class to give properties to that H1 element. And even though that class or that rule doesn't come last in the Cascade, it comes before the other H1 rule, it is still the one being applied. We can see that the rule I've given to the class is the color red and a solid border that's 3 pixels and blue. If I hadn't used that class, then we would be seeing the second rule, which is the color blue on the text and a solid border that's 4 pixels and red. And so that's kind of how specificity works. The more specific your selector is, the more that's the one that's going to win out. That's the one that's going to be applied. So that's just kind of a brief overview of specificity. There are like pseudo classes and pseudo elements that are applied in there, and that those have different specificities as well. And so if you'd like to learn more about that, I'd encourage you to do so. And I kind of learned about that I have my source at the end of this PowerPoint, and you can go to that page and look more into that. The third thing is importance, or the important rule. So this tag, or this declaration, kind of breaks the cascade. So it doesn't matter if you have if it's just an element selector, class selector, ID selector. It doesn't matter. If you have a rule that has the important declaration, then that rule has the most importance. It will be applied. But it is recommended that we do not use this declaration unless we absolutely have to. It can cause problems in your code, and it's just better to use either the rules of specificity or Cascade. But here is an example of that. Like I'm showing here, I'm using specificity and Cascade here to show you how the important rule or declaration works. We can see that I have a class of heading with the color red, a solid border that's 3 pixels and blue, and then under that I have just an H1 rule with the color violet, but I've made the declaration of important. And then below that I have another H1 rule with the color blue and a solid border that's 4 pixels and red. So if we look at this next example, we'll see what's applied, and it is the color violet. We're still getting the property of a border, a solid border that's 3 pixels and blue from the class selector in place of just the red border from the element selector. But the color, which should be red by the class selector, is being kind of kicked out, and violet is being used in its place because we have that important declaration there. So that's how important works. Again, not supposed to use it unless, they recommend that you don't use it unless you absolutely have to. So next we'll talk about inheritance quickly. Inheritance is simply that some child elements inherit some CSS properties from their parents. An example, brief example here is that I have the body element. I've given it a few properties, and I've given it the color orange and the font size of 16. Now, if we look at what we have down here, I have a header, or an H1 that says my first heading. That is not the body element, it is an H1 element. It is a child of the body element, but it is still being given the same color property. And then below that I have a paragraph that says my first paragraph, that is also not the body element, but is a child of the body element, and therefore is inheriting the font size of 16 pixels and the color of orange. So that's my presentation on cascades and inheritance. And here's my source. I got all of my information from MDN Web Docs, and there's the link to that. And then I also used, it's not listed here, but the screenshots that you saw of code were from the Try It text editor from w3.org. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what